Hi everyone, this is Ms. Ramani, and for this lesson, we're going to be learning about the immune system. Before we begin exploring the immune system, I want to tell you about a boy named David Vedder. David was born in 1971 and became famously known as the boy in the bubble. He was born with a disease called severe combined immune deficiency, or SCID for short, and this type of disease is one of the most severe diseases that affect the immune system. It is called an immunodeficiency disease. So David's immune system basically was not working, and because of that, he needed to live in a completely germ-free environment, hence the bubble. At the time of his birth in 1971, a bone marrow transplant was the only method of treating this disease, and the family could not find an exact match to David's tissue type, so he was not able to get this procedure done until he was 12 years old. So for 12 years, David lived in this protective bubble at all times. Any second outside of that bubble would have exposed him to germs, and he would have died of disease complications as a result of that without any ability to fight those diseases naturally because he did not have a working immune system. Now, when he was 12, there was a bone marrow donor that was found that could match David, and he did undergo a procedure for bone marrow transplant. Unfortunately, the story does not have a happy ending. After 4 weeks after receiving his transplant, David developed lymphoma, which is a type of cancer, and later on it was tracked that there was a virus that the donor, had that was transmitted to David during the transplant, and that later on became cancer. So unfortunately, David only lived to be 12 years old and only managed to survive 4 weeks outside of his bubble. So the reason why I told the story is just to show you how important our immune system is. I mean, every day our immune system is busy defending us against pathogens, to the point that someone born without a working immune system literally has to live inside a plastic bubble in order to be protected from all the germs. That's the bacteria, the viruses, the fungi, the protists, that all of us basically fight on a daily basis. Every day, our immune system is fighting against disease organisms that are around us, and a relatively small amount of time do we actually get sick from those disease causing organisms or pathogens. Our immune system is extremely efficient at keeping most of those diseases at bay and basically protecting us from those invading organisms. So, when we're talking about our immune system, it's best to sort of divide it up into different categories to better understand it. And the best way to do this is to actually divide it into two categories and three lines of defense. So the first category is what we call nonspecific or innate immunity. And that basically means that this part of our immune system is not targeting anything in particular, is basically targeting any and all organisms, pathogens, foreign invaders that are trying to get into our body or got into our body without specifically targeting a particular pathogen, just trying to fight anything that gets in. And the nonspecific or innate immunity is actually divided into what we call the first line of defense, which is all about just preventing things from getting into our body. So think about it as the walls around a castle, for example. So if you have a castle, you want to defend it, you have these walls around it. Well, that's part of the first line of defense, trying to prevent invaders from getting into your castle. So in this particular case, it could be something like our skin. But obviously, there's also doorways and gateways and tunnels through which things can get in. So we have guards at those places as well. So for example, our nostrils are a place where pathogens can get in because we have to allow for air to enter our body. So we have these orifices. Well, we cover that gateway with mucus and with hairs and other things that can trap things that are trying to get in. So that's what our first line of defense is indiscriminate. It will try to prevent any foreign object from getting in and trapping it that way. So it's not particularly looking for something specific. So that's what we call it to be non-specific or innate immunity, because we're all kind of born with this. The second level of innate or non-specific immunity is what we call the second line of defense. And this is what happens when things actually do get into our body. They bypass the first line of defense somehow. And now our immune system is going to try to kill anything or destroy anything that gets in past that first line of defense. So anything that has gotten into our cells, our tissues, our blood, and it involves just tracking those things down and setting up a series of defense mechanisms that are going to try to kill them or make it more difficult for them to survive. And then the second category, is what we call specific or acquired immunity. So this type of immunity is extremely specific to a particular pathogen. So it's all about targeting a very specific organism that has gotten into our body. It is called also acquired immunity because unlike non-specific immunity that we're all sort of born with, we acquire this immunity over a lifetime. So we are not born with acquired immunity. We need to develop that as we grow. So this is that type of immunity that comes from experience. As our body experiences different pathogens in a variety of different ways, we will be able to remember and target a very, very specific pathogen. So this is where we get into an actual immunity, when people actually become immune to diseases because they've acquired that third line of defense. Okay, so let's look at each of these in a little bit more detail. So let's start with the first line of defense. So like I said, it's all about stopping pathogens from entering our body, and it acts both as a physical and a chemical barrier. So for example, the physical barrier that is most obvious is of course our skin, and then we have all those gateways and tunnels and orifices through which our skin can allow things to get in. So our nostrils, our ear canals, our eyes, our genitals, our mouth, these are all openings within our skin. Obviously, if you get a cut, that's also an opening within your skin. And so, but we have chemicals within those natural orifices to sort of stop also from things from getting in and trapping organisms that are trying to get in. So for example, our ears will have earwax, our eyes will produce tears, the tears themselves will have enzymes called lysozymes, which are pathogen killing enzymes. We have the mucus in our nose, like I said, and the hairs in our nostrils. We have, say, things that get into our mouth. We obviously have to eat, and so that's an entryway for pathogens. Well, we have stomach acid in our stomach that all there to kill bacteria, as well as viruses and other things. So these are all both the chemical barrier and the physical barrier that we have. There's also reflexes. So we have the mechanical barriers, the chemical barriers, but we also have reflexes like sneezing or coughing that is all about also expelling things out of our body that got in. So whenever we sneeze or we cough, it's just basically our body's way of trying to get rid of pathogens that have gotten in by expelling them forcefully out of our bodies. Now, the second line of defense is engaged when a pathogen has breached that first line of defense. So it has gotten into our body. And it's a non-specific defense once again. So it's not targeting anything in particular, just anything that gets in is going to trigger the second line of defense. And it has three main components: inflammation, something called phagocytosis, and something you're probably familiar with, which is a fever. So let's take a look at each of these. Inflammation is our body's response to damage or to an invasion. So inflammation happens both when we are attacked by a pathogen and our body determines that a pathogen is present, or also even just damage. Whenever cells themselves are damaged, let's say for example, you were running and you hurt your knee, that's not necessarily hurts and gets inflamed because bacteria got in. That is gets inflamed because there was damage to tissue. So any kind of damage to tissues or any kind of response to a pathogen invader will trigger an inflammation response. And the thing that triggers this inflammation is a chemical called histamine. Histamine is basically a tiny little chemical that is released by both damaged cells or by white blood cells that trigger this response, which is basically just about bringing more blood to the damaged area. And the reason that happens is because blood brought to the damaged area is going to bring with it more oxygen, more nutrients, um, more heat, and these are all things that damaged tissues need to help repair themselves. And these are all things that white blood cells need in order to help fight a pathogen. So it's a great response whenever you have either an injury or whether you have an attack by, say, bacteria, because the white blood cells that are going to fight the bacteria, they need to get there, and they get there through blood. So you need, by bringing more blood to the area, you're bringing in the troops that way. You're opening up the lines so that more troops can get in at a faster rate. You're also bringing with it a lot of nutrients that they need. But similarly, if you're just injured, again, you bring more blood to the area, bringing in with it nutrients and oxygen and all those things that the cells themselves need to repair. Now, as a result of this inflammation, though, you have the symptoms that can occur when you have too much blood flowing to a particular area and focusing on damaged tissues. And that is, it becomes red because blood is red. So if you have more blood in the area, that area is going to be red. It becomes hot to the touch because blood brings with it heat. It becomes swollen, and it's painful because now the nerve cells are going to be damaged and brought to the surface. So all of those are symptoms of inflammation. If you've ever had, say, a cut become infected, and what we look for when we're looking for an infected cut, for example, is those signs of inflammation: redness, puffiness, heat, swelling, right? So, like I said, the blood that was brought to the injured side and caused the inflammation was partly brought there in order to bring more white blood cells to fight the invaders. So, that's the next part: phagocytosis. Phagocytosis is basically a process by which a particular type of white blood cells, often called phagocytes, will attack and destroy and essentially eat any pathogen that enters our body. So let's say it could be eating the bacteria that has invaded that cut. It could also destroy not just the bacteria, uh, but it could destroy maybe cells that have been injured by the bacteria. Oftentimes that happens when you have a viral infection. The virus enters our cells and then either destroys the cells while it's replicating, or it's damaging the cells in the process of replicating. And so our white blood cells might not just attack the virus, but might also attack the cells that have been damaged by the viral replication process. Our immune system is really like an army, and there's a lot of different components. We're actually just going to be touching upon some of the components of the immune system. So don't be surprised if later on, if you take courses in university or college that teach you about the immune system, you might end up encountering a lot more components than the ones that I'm describing today. I'm just trying to keep things very simple and straightforward. But one of the things that we also need to remember is that, like any sort of army, the immune system has to have a method of communication. So white blood cells have a variety of different types, and some of them release proteins that communicate with other immune cells. And so one of those types of proteins or chemical signals are called cytokines that are released as a signal to communicate with other immune cells. One of the things that the cytokines do is it can actually trigger a fever and other symptoms that we usually get when we feel sick, like lethargy, which means tiredness, or muscle pain and nausea. And the reason why our body does that is actually in order to help us get better and help boost our immune system, believe it or not. So, for example, a fever, that raised temperature that is caused by a fever has actually been shown in scientific studies to improve the performance of our immune system. So, by raising our body temperature, we are allowing optimal conditions for our immune system to work better. It also tends to reduce the growth of some pathogens. So we're sort of trying to slow down their growth and boost up our immune system by raising our body temperature. The way that we raise our body temperature is actually quite neat. We don't so much raise our temperature as change the thermostat in our brain. So we have a part of our brain called the hypothalamus that has a little temperature gauge. Think about it like the thermostat in your house, and you set it a particular temperature, right? And so just like in your house, if you want to make things warmer, you raise the temperature on the thermostat, and then sensors, thermometers in your house will detect that the temperature in the house is not matching the temperature that has been set, and then your furnace will turn on and the house will become warmer until it reaches that temperature, at which point, the furnace will shut off unless it gets cooler again. So the same thing happens in our brain. We have this thermostat that is usually set at around, let's say, 37 degrees Celsius, which is the average body temperature for people. And when we have an infection, the cytokines trigger the resetting of that temperature in the hypothalamus. So they raise that temperature, let's say, up to 39 degrees Celsius. So now our body no longer feels comfortable at 37 degrees Celsius. At 37 degrees Celsius, our brain is telling us we are cold because we need to be at 39 degrees Celsius. So then we feel chills. If you've ever been sick and you suddenly feel really, really cold, but everybody else around you feels fine, that's because your thermostat has been reset. So even though you are at normal body temperature, it feels like you are cold because your body has raised the thermostat. So what's our response to cold? We shiver. We also do behavioral things like get under a blanket and bundle ourselves up, drink or eat something hot. All of those things raise our body temperature and cause our fever. So our fever is actually caused by the behaviors that we engage in and by the shivering that our body does in order to raise that temperature until it reaches that set temperature that has been set by the thermostat. The cytokines also do a few other things like trigger symptoms like tiredness and muscle pain and nausea. A lot of the times that's just a response that will help keep us in bed. In other words, you feel tired because your body is diverting energy and resources to your immune system. So in a way to help you fight the disease, you're diverting the energy to that particular endeavor, so you feel really, really tired. It also forces you to get into bed, which again helps conserve your energy. So that's why you feel sleepy when you're sick. You feel very, very tired. It's basically your body's response of diverting resources to the fight. The muscle pain is a result of some chemicals that are released during the fight that causes your nerve cells, your pain receptors, to become hyper-tuned. So every little thing hurts a lot more, and that is just basically a chemical response to the fight. Anyway, so that's the second line of defense, and that's it for what we call our innate or non-specific immunity, which just fights basically anything that tries to get into our bodies. The third line of defense is what we're going to talk about next. But I just want to reiterate once again that I've simplified the lessons that you're getting so that we are not looking at every component. So for example, as far as innate immunity, there's a variety of different types of white blood cells that have many different roles that they play throughout this entire fight we're not going to get into, right? But we're going to now focus on the second part of this picture at the bottom that's called adaptive immunity or the specific immunity, which is basically the engaging of our third line of defense. And so as we talk about this, I want to first of all talk about how our body can tell when to engage in an attack. And one of the things that is at the heart of our immune system's ability to fight invaders is to recognize invaders. Our immune system has to be able to tell when we've been attacked by something that doesn't belong there. And at the heart of this is the ability of distinguishing what is our cells and what belongs in our bodies and what is foreign and does not belong. So this ability to distinguish between self and non-self is essential. So what happens is that every cell in your body, including for some people, the red blood cells, have these little surface proteins that basically our body can recognize as self. So think about it as having these little tags or markers, and we recognize our own tags or markers. Our immune system sees them and says, okay, cool, you belong here, you're a citizen of this body, let's move on. And if it finds something that does not have the right tag or marker, it will just flag it as an invader. And that is how we can tell whether or not we we need to fight that cell or not. Now, sometimes our immune system does have to fight itself, but normally our immune system does not attack our own body tissues. There are some exceptions, though. For example, our immune system is good at also finding and targeting and destroying cells that have been injured or have become cancerous. And so this is a good thing. So even though our immune system can recognize self versus non-self and can recognize cells as belonging to ourselves, and of course cancer cells would be our own cells, or damaged cells would be our own cells, our immune system also is able to determine, often, sometimes it misses them, but is able to determine when we have some cells that need to be destroyed that actually belong to us. And that's a big part of what our immune system does, is basically destroy cancer cells before they become tumors. Now, sometimes our immune system mistakes our own cells for something that needs to be destroyed when it shouldn't. So, for example, there are such a type of diseases called autoimmune diseases, sometimes also called autoimmune disorders, that are basically caused by our own immune system attacking our own cells. For example, maybe one of them that you might be familiar with might be rheumatoid arthritis. So rheumatoid arthritis is arthritis that is actually triggered not by old age or by wear and tear and injury, but is actually triggered by the immune system of the patient just suddenly deciding that some of the cells in the joints need to be attacked. So it is caused by an attack of the person's own immune system. Type 1 diabetes, which is the diabetes in which patients have lost their pancreatic cells that produce insulin. Those pancreatic cells that produce insulin in type 1 diabetics are basically destroyed by the patient's own immune system. Doctors still have no idea what triggers the immune system to suddenly one day decide to destroy those cells in the pancreas that produce insulin, but that's what causes it. Another one that you might have heard of is MS, or multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is caused by the immune system attacking the nerve cells of a patient. So our nerve cells have this fatty layer surrounding each of our nerve cells called myelin. And myelin is essential for making sure that nerve signals are transmitted smoothly from the brain to a body part, from a sensor or in our skin, for example, into our brain. So all of those nerve signals can travel very smoothly and very quickly without disruption because the nerve cells are insulated by this fatty layer called myelin. Well, in people with multiple sclerosis, what happens is that the immune system starts eating away at the myelin. So it's almost like having wires that become where the insulation on the wires becomes destroyed over time, and something is eating at that insulation. So by eating at the insulation, it disrupts the signals, and that's what causes that. So this is one of the ways in which our immune system can actually be the bad guy, because in some people, the immune system itself causes disease by destroying the cell itself. So whenever our immune system encounters something foreign, something that does not belong, we call that something an antigen. An antigen is essentially anything that enters our body that is capable of causing an immune response. And our immune response is basically to make something called antibodies. And antibodies are very specific to the particular antigen that enters our body. So for example, an antigen could be something like a bacterial cell. Our body will recognize a bacterial cell as foreign, and will develop and form antibodies that are very, very specific to that bacteria to help us fight it. Unfortunately, sometimes our immune system ends up thinking that things that are foreign but not necessarily bad for us are antigens. So for example, our immune system can recognize an organ that has been transplanted into our body as something that does not belong there. And as a result, it will undergo rejection. So if somebody gets a heart transplant, one of the biggest concerns when it comes to transplantation medicine is the fear of rejection, of the body rejecting the organ. And the reason for that is because the body can recognize that that particular heart, say, does not have the same markers or tags on the surface of the cells that the patient's own body has. So it recognizes as not belonging there, as non-self. And so rejection can happen, which is the reason why whenever people have need a transplant of an organ, they have to find a donor that is a match. No one other than an identical twin will ever find 100% a perfect match, but we can try to match tissue types as closely as possible to sort of try to trick the immune system into believing that that tissue actually is self as opposed to it being an antigen. Of course, there's always that risk, and so one of the things that can be done usually when somebody needs an organ transplant is that after the transplantation happens, the patient will have to take medicine that suppresses their immune system so that the immune system doesn't realize that something that doesn't belong there is in there. An antigen, of course, can be something like a bacteria, a virus, a fungi, a protist. These are the times when we want our immune system to fight them. So these are true antigens, things that do not belong there. But sometimes an antigen could be something like food or pollen or dust particles. And so this is why people get allergies. And this is why allergy symptoms are very similar to disease symptoms, because it is basically when antigens that are non-pathogenic, like dust or a food substance, will trigger an immune response. So what is our immune response? Sneezing, coughing, watery eyes, swelling. These are all part of our first and second line of defense, right? So the third line of defense is engaged, though, when a particular antigen has been found and the body has taken the time to study it and is able to make antibodies that are very, very specific and targeted to that antigen. And so the cells that are responsible for the production of these antibodies are called B cells and T cells. And these are extremely important because it is the production of those antibodies that helps us win the fight against an invasion. Because then now we are not just blindly fighting a disease that has entered our body, we are targeting that specific pathogen very directly. And so the way that it works is the antibody, which looks a little bit like the letter Y, as you can see in these pictures, binds to the antigen at the tips of that protein in what we call very specific binding sites. And they're extremely specific. So for every antigen that has ever triggered an immune response in your body, you have created a very specific antibody for that antigen. So by the time that you're, say, something like 16 or 17 years old, you have had 16 or 17 years worth of antibodies accumulating in your immune system. And you keep a few of those for every disease that you've ever encountered, unfortunately, every tree pollen that you've ever had an allergic reaction to, or every food you've ever had an allergic reaction to. You keep copies of those antibodies so that whenever you're encountering any of those antigens again, your body can now fight them much, much faster. So the antibodies then send a signal telling your body to start making millions of more copies of that particular antibody in order to mount a response. So let's give an example here of, let's say, a person that is getting a virus that infects their throat. So they breathe in the virus managed to make it through the first line of defense, and the second line of defense is triggered as the virus starts to reproduce in the throat cells, which brings in inflammation, heat, and swelling, which causes the throat to feel swollen and puffy. It also can trigger a fever, and the body's just sort of not necessarily winning the fight against the virus this way, because regardless of the fact that you have a fever and a swollen throat, that's not going to win the war against the virus. What's going to happen is that in the few days after that infection, your body's busy trying to learn exactly what that virus looks like in order to create antibodies that are very specific to that. Once the antibodies are made, though, millions of copies of those antibodies then are released, and they can now go and target that virus specifically. We're not just blindly trying to eat them or destroying the cells that are attacked by the virus itself, but we can try to now target that virus specifically, like you see in the picture at the bottom, where the virus is now surrounded by antibodies. So when antibodies finally are released in millions, they can do three things. The first thing is that they recognize the antigen, the pathogen, surround it, and they basically tag it so that it is more easily recognized by the white blood cells that are going to eat it. And these are called macrophages. These are the phagocytes. There's a lot of words that basically mean white blood cells. And so these white blood cells can more easily recognize the pathogen and attack it. It also makes it difficult for the pathogen to move. So now that it's been surrounded by antibodies, it cannot move around and attack new cells. So now it's more easily caught by the white blood cells that are trying to eat it. And next, it can also prevent it from reproducing. So now three things have happened to that pathogen because of the antibodies. It's been tagged so that it can more easily be destroyed by the white blood cells that will destroy it. It makes it so it cannot be moved. It cannot move. So it's been, it's stuck in place. So now again, it makes it much easier for the white blood cells to attack it, and it cannot reproduce. So essentially, it makes it much easier for the disease to not get any worse because now we don't have this massive amounts of viral or bacterial reproduction happening. Okay. Once you are better from the disease, now we get into what we call actual immunity. And what happens is that special types of lymphocytes, which are basically a type of immune cell that are called memory B cells and memory T cells, are going to actually remember that antigen after that first infection and will essentially keep a library of what the different antigens that you've ever been exposed to look like, so that if you've ever after this point are exposed to that same antigen, we can trigger an immune response much faster. And this is what we call immunity. Because let's say you've been attacked by a flu virus and you felt sick the first few days. Eventually your body learned what the virus looked like. It was able to make antibodies that were very specific to that virus. Now you have immunity to that virus. Memory B cells and T cells within your body will remember that antigen, that virus, keep a library of what it looked like. And so that if you've ever encountered that exact flu virus again, you have those antibodies already. You won't go through the fever and inflammation and all those symptoms that are a result of your second line of defense. Your body will simply trigger that third line of defense right away. Your body will make copies of the antibodies that will fight that virus directly, and you won't even feel symptoms before your body's already destroyed it. And so that's what we call immunity. And so there are a few ways by which we can acquire this immunity in this protection that we develop over a lifetime, this ability to just remember antigens that we've been exposed to in the past so that we can mount a response much faster. And so the two main ways that we can acquire those are either actively or passively. And there's active immunity that we can acquire naturally, and there's also active immunity that can actually involve medical intervention, which we say that we develop artificially. And for passive immunity, it's the same thing. So there's passive immunity that we can acquire naturally, and there's passive immunity that can actually involve some sort of medical or artificial intervention. So let's just talk about these methods. And so the first one is active immunity. Active immunity is what happens when we expose ourselves to a pathogen. We're exposed ourselves to a bacteria or a virus, and therefore now we have to develop antibodies for them in response to that attack, but then our bodies have an ability to remember those antigens and keep some of those antibodies for the future in our memory B cells and our memory T cells. And so if we're ever exposed to that antigen again, that virus or that bacteria, we can mount a response real quick. Now, to get that active immunity going, you have to be exposed to the pathogen. So there's two ways of doing that. The first way is just naturally getting sick. You get sick, you build antibodies, you build immunity. Now you're immune, right? The second way is artificially, a vaccine. So a vaccine basically will build your antibodies by exposing you to either some of the toxins that are made by the bacteria or virus, which is what our body recognizes as the antigen, or pieces of the bacteria and virus that our body can then recognize and mount a response to, or sometimes weak or dead versions of the virus or bacteria that, again, allow our bodies to remember what the antigen looks like and mount an active immune response. So we either get sick or we get a vaccination, right? So let's bring it down to, for example, what is happening right now with COVID-19. So this is a disease that is caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And so there's two ways by which people can potentially become immune to that virus. The first one is naturally by becoming sick. It's still not 100% known whether or not becoming sick with SARS-CoV-2 grants us a patient permanent immunity to that virus. There's a little bit of a gray area, I think, in terms of the research that has been done so far. We can't say for sure yet that 100% immunity is achieved by becoming sick from the virus. But the other way, it could have been if we get a vaccination going. So if it might take a while to get a vaccine, but a vaccine would be another way of granting people immunity to the virus. Okay, the second way is passively. So passive immunity basically is not about making your own antibodies, but about getting antibodies transferred into your body directly from another person or another organism. And so you can either make your antibodies, that's active immunity, because your body is making the antibodies yourself, or you can just get the antibodies from someone else. Now, this type of immunity is not permanent because eventually the antibodies themselves, which are small proteins, will get destroyed. And the moment that the antibodies get destroyed, you no longer have immunity because you also have no way of making your own antibodies. So it only lasts for as long as you are getting those antibodies placed directly into your body in order to fight the disease. So the natural way by which we can actually get these antibodies for diseases is, and the only way that we get it naturally, is when you're an infant or a newborn, and that's from mother to child. Through the womb, some antibodies can transfer from the mother to the child through the placenta. Not a lot, but a few can. And a lot of them can also be transferred through breastfeeding. So this is one of the reasons why mothers like to breastfeed their babies for a long time, and why it's said to be like extremely good for children to be breastfed, is because not only are the children getting really good nutrition from the mother, but they're also getting immune cells. They're getting antibodies directly from the mother's body, antibodies that the mother has produced based on her exposure to diseases over her lifetime, and she can pass them on to her child, making the child less likely to get sick, because a baby obviously has never been exposed to disease and is very vulnerable to almost every disease out there. So this passive immunity involves the mother passively passing on antibodies in breast milk through her baby. Of course, the moment that the baby stops drinking breast milk, the antibodies eventually disappear because they're only there through the transfer from the mother. The baby has not made their own antibodies. And so that protection is gone the moment that breastfeeding stops. Artificially, though, instead of getting a vaccine, sometimes you might actually get antibodies from immune individuals injected into your body directly. A vaccine is great because a vaccine allows you to make your own antibodies prior to getting a disease so that you never even develop symptoms to the disease if you're exposed to the disease. However, an antibody serum, we call them serums, we don't call them vaccines, can be given to a patient who has been exposed to a disease already and does not have the time to make their own antibodies in order to fight the disease, and therefore the antibodies can be put into the patient, and the antibodies can help fight the disease for the patient themselves. And again, this is only useful as long as the patient is given a continuous dose of the antibodies, because the antibodies can only last for so long. Now, antibody treatment is extremely difficult to develop. Basically, in order to develop antibody treatments for someone, the antibodies need to be isolated from an individual, oftentimes a person or an animal that has already been infected with the disease, has survived the disease, and has developed their own antibodies naturally for the disease. And so the antibodies can be isolated. Then they have to be cloned in a lab so that in a lab they can be, the few antibodies can be made into many, many antibodies, and then put into a serum to introduce to the patient. It is extremely difficult to isolate specific antibodies to a specific virus. So this type of treatment is not available for every disease. For most diseases, there's only a few that it could be available for, but it's a possible treatment that is out there. Okay, everyone, so that's your lesson on the immune system. And I do apologize, it was a long lesson. However, as you can see from this picture, the immune system is actually a lot more complicated than what I laid out in this lesson. I tried to simplify it for this course. And if you have any more questions about this, feel free to ask me in class. So I'll talk to you later.